Observations of my advanced training for conservation in Paris, France. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be here with you tonight to speak about my experiences and observations in Paris about 10 years ago, both as a cabinet maker and now as a trained restorer conservator. I took the rather difficult choice enrolling in the 2004 and 5 semester at the infamous École Department of Conservation Restoration, after learning about the institution's particular history and its unparalleled reputation for offering the finest training of furniture making and the beaux-arts. My apprehension about going to a country whose language I did not fully know was justified. Either I did have 2 years in college and 4 years in high school, at least in the beginning. Unfortunately, I did not have the time to prepare myself linguistically before my arrival, but I did have an ally that served as an interpreter for part of the course, especially for those dreaded lectures. The rest of the time, I struggled on many fronts. There were so many things I had to adjust to all at once. Each day, the Echo Bull took me in a different avenue. Please, somebody turn your phone off in the back, I'm sorry. Exposure to professions necessary in restoration, such as sculpting, bronzing, and metalwork, upholstery, marquetry, the history of furniture making, and chemistry. And of course, the most important being the rudiments of restoration and conservation. Eventually, I began to grasp the language and the rigor of the immersion of the course, as well as the need to comprehend the overall procedures of each of those satellite professions in order to differentiate between proper restoration and bastardizations. But more than anything, realize that everything is attached to the history of France. It is not an exaggeration if history is not understood, respected, and employed. Your restoration will be terribly flawed, ineffectual, and worse, it will lessen the value of a quality antique and not enhance it. By understanding history, I mean that the periods must be identified. Woods that are used in restoration and conservation must correspond not just the piece in which it was constructed, but it must be as close to the period as possible. The grain, the quality must be the same. In addition, a fine restorer must know how his predecessors worked, which tools and which techniques were employed, and when and how. One of the most intriguing aspects of restoration and conservation is the multiple methods that can be applied. More than half of them are centuries and centuries old, and the others are an amalgamation of modern techniques incorporated into the traditional. Every turn in true restoration requires investigation, confirmation, and retrospection. The slowness of this procedure was rather stifling for me at first. Of course, as an American, we live on time rations, cutting corners, seeking the most time-efficient method possible. At the École Bull, we had the time to consider the proper approach and possible consequences if we didn't take our time, a luxury I've never had before or possibly ever since. The varying options were daunting, for me especially when the information translated seemed to be a bit contradictory at times. Naturally, I later realized that, of course, these methods were daunting. What stood in front of me represented the practices that have been established over 6 centuries, practices that are more or less well known by well-trained professionals. These master cabinet furniture makers and master carpenters are the inheritors of a massive diffusion of information, crisscrossing important regions of all of France. The tradition of gaining experience as a journeyman after completing apprenticeships of 8 years, and then perfecting skills by working in different establishments, and sometimes doing a tour de France. This produced seasoned cabinet makers and carpenters that reached an apex in the 18th century. Ultimately, the great cabinet makers were hybrids of many masters, artisans that accumulated a variety of methods that still exist today across the globe. Implicit in this tradition is that of an exchange of techniques, embellished by each subsequent generation, an accumulation of techniques that would become an integral part of French construction, the most intricate and acute construction of any furniture on the planet. If there is a singular difference between what I held to be true about construction before the écoboule and after it, it would be that of the interior construction is important as the exterior. Of course, a great deal of concentration is placed on the kind of veneer or marquetry with ornamentation that will be added, but the construction itself holds a kind of dignity to, or perhaps greater than, the exterior alone. I remember distinctively on the first day I was given a period piece from the Hospital Saint Louis that I will restore throughout the semester. Each student is given an object commensurate with his or her proposed abilities. As I began my analysis, I was enthralled by the feel and sound of the drawers, sliding in and out, regardless of the overall state of this Napoleon III bureau plate. Its degradation and warping, its construction was seamless. The dovetails flawless, and I listened to its voice. Most pieces of furniture do speak. They creak and moan when adjusting to weather changes. They crack and snap and complain a bit too much at times from too much weight and abuse by their owners or their custodians. But they also sing as they slide when properly composed, and their smell delineates its species and country of origin. The finest compliment I can give any cabinet maker is to be able to smell, hear, and touch with pleasure the history of their craft, those that have gone before us, before me, to identify their tools and their adhesives, their movements when planing and sawing and sculpting and carving. And I have been privy to the traces of some of the most prolific cabinet makers in history.